Frank Nguyen's boots clicked in perfect rhythm across rain-dark marble, the cadence so exact it seemed to steady the morning itself. 21 steps, pause, turn, repeat. Under a cold white sky, with mist drifting low across Arlington's rolling hillside, he moved like a vow made visible, his face an unreadable mask of discipline, as the tomb stood luminous and still. The hour had not yet surrendered to daylight's full brightness, and that restraint in the sky matched the restraint in every person gathered behind the chains. The marble of the plaza held a thin sheen of rain, reflecting pale light and fragments of uniforms, coats and faces in broken silver. Beyond the terrace, white headstones descended in geometric ranks over the green slopes, each one angled with such careful order that distance itself looked disciplined. The place felt less like a cemetery than a cathedral built from stone, weather, and memory. And the people standing there understood they were guests inside a sanctuary where voices were supposed to soften and gestures were supposed to mean something. Frank stood 6'2", broad-shouldered, without showmanship, built like a wall that had learned to walk upright. His kepi hat sat at a precise angle. His jacket held every crease sharp enough to cut glass. His buttons caught the pale morning and gave it back in quiet flashes. His white gloves were pristine against the dark wood and steel of the M14 he carried, with ceremonial steadiness. His boots were polished to a mirror shine so clear that even on wet stone they reflected a narrow strip of sky. Nothing on him drifted, sagged, or wandered. The uniform was immaculate, not because he feared inspection, but because precision at the tomb was a language, and he spoke it fluently. He advanced his 21st step and halted. The pause that followed was not emptiness. It was wait. Then came the turn, exact and unhurried, rifle brought across with mechanical grace, shoulders squared toward the line once more. To the untrained eye, he seemed almost motionless between movements, a ceremonial figure performing a script. What the crowd could not see was the constant sweep of his awareness, a professional vigilance shaped by years in places where one misread gesture could cost lives. Even here, in silence, his instincts were on high alert, cataloging foot placement near the rail, shifting posture in the second row, the lift and drop of breath across dozens of strangers holding themselves still out of respect. By 8:10 that morning, the mist had thinned just enough to reveal the edges of the amphitheater more clearly, and the crowd had grown to nearly 80. They were an American cross-section held together by quiet, an elderly Marine with a silver cane and a field jacket that sat neatly over a pressed shirt. Two middle school brothers in matching Navy rain shells who kept glancing from the tomb to their father's face for cues on how to stand. A gold star mother in black gloves, chin lifted, eyes fixed forward with the kind of composure that had already paid every price there was to pay. 3 high school students with phones in hand but screens lowered, as if they had sensed that documentation was not the same as witness. Near the front rail sat a 9-year-old girl in a wheelchair, blanket tucked around her knees, a unit patch from her father's old battalion, pinned carefully, where she could keep touching it with her thumb. Her name was Lena Ortiz. She had asked her mother, in a whisper that never reached the chain line, whether the guard ever got tired. Her mother, Maria, had leaned down and answered softly, "He gets tired. He does it anyway." Lena had nodded with solemn concentration and kept watching Frank's boots as if each step might teach her something she would need later. A few rows back stood a pair of retired school teachers holding hands, both wearing small veteran support pins on their coats. A father in a work jacket lifted his son briefly so the boy could see over shoulders, then set him down again before the child's shoes touched the rail. A woman with a nurse's badge still clipped to her blouse stood alone, posture straight, lips pressed together in an expression of private remembrance. Two young men in business attire arrived late, removed their caps immediately, and shifted to the side rather than crossing anyone's sight line. Nobody announced rules. The place enforced them by presence. The only recurring sound was Frank's cadence on marble. Heel, sole, halt. Heel, sole, halt. The rhythm traveled across the plaza and returned from the stone like a measured heartbeat. There were birds somewhere on the lower lawns, but even they seemed distant, as if the acoustics of the terrace preferred boots and breath to anything ornamental. A flag moved above them with slow authority, never snapping, only lifting and settling in the damp morning wind. When the cloth rose, color sharpened against the overcast sky. When it eased, the entire scene seemed to exhale. Frank completed another pass. He stopped. He turned. He began again. Inside that disciplined repetition, memory traveled with him. Not as distraction, never that, but as ballast. He had carried far heavier loads in other uniforms under harsher skies, and those years had carved habits into him that the crowd would never read from his face. 2 tours in Afghanistan and 1 deployment into Syria had taught him to read terrain quickly, to hear panic before it became movement, to distinguish noise from threat. They had also taught him the cost of names spoken in past tense. At the tomb, those lessons did not disappear. They were refined into ritual. Here, vigilance was not about enemy fire. It was about safeguarding remembrance against carelessness, spectacle, and forgetfulness. Across his left shoulder, beneath the immaculate fabric, scar tissue mapped an old shrapnel wound that tightened in cold weather and storm pressure. The pain never announced itself on his expression. It simply entered the day with him like weather that only he could feel. When the wind shifted and dampness deepened, the skin pulled. He adjusted nothing, showed nothing, and kept cadence. Discipline at this post was not performance. It was an agreement between body and duty that had no audience clause, A docent near the back murmured to a cluster of visitors, voice kept low enough not to disturb the ceremony. "He serves with the 3rd Infantry Regiment, the Old Guard," she said. "The pace and turns are exact by design." A man in a baseball cap asked, almost under his breath, "How long can he do that?" The docent answered, "Long enough to remind us this isn't about comfort." The man swallowed, nodded once, and returned his gaze to the sentinel. Frank reached the end of the mat, halted, and executed the turn with that same measured precision that never looked hurried and never looked relaxed. The rifle shifted to the shoulder away from the tomb at the prescribed point, symbolic and exact, then settled back into its disciplined line. In the cool air, each movement looked almost carved rather than performed. His eyes stayed locked on a point only he could see, not from detachment but from concentration, so complete it had no spare bandwidth for display. The crowd's silence held, yet it was not passive silence. It carried layers, reverence from veterans who had worn uniforms of their own, curiosity from children encountering ritual for the first time, grief from families who had folded flags in living rooms and church aisles, and gratitude from strangers who did not have personal stories of military loss, but understood, at least in this place, that their ordinary lives sat atop uncommon sacrifice. In a nation often loud with opinions, the hush at the tomb felt like consensus. Lena shifted in her wheelchair and straightened the patch on her blanket with deliberate fingers. Her mother noticed and squeezed her shoulder. The elderly Marine with the silver cane repositioned his weight and then held himself at rigid attention for the duration of Frank's next pass, Jaw set, eyes bright with unshed tears he did not wipe away. One of the high school students quietly slid his phone into his pocket and stood with both hands at his sides. A little boy asked his grandfather, "Why does he walk that way?" The grandfather answered without taking his eyes off the sentinel, "Because some promises have a shape." The mist continued to lift in thin ribbons, revealing more of the hill and the patient rows beyond. The polished marble of the sarcophagus caught new light along its edges, and lettering cut into stone seemed to deepen as moisture receded. The wreath stands near the ceremonial area waited in orderly stillness for the formal sequence to come. A uniformed staff member checked timing from a discreet distance, then stepped back to preserve the visual symmetry of the approach. Every role had a place. Every place carried meaning. Frank took another 21 steps and paused at the line, the halt so absolute it seemed to seal the air. In that stillness, he felt the familiar convergence of public ritual and private vow. He had come to this duty not to be seen, but to stand watch for those whose names were unknown, whose final hours had no witness left to speak for them, and for one friend whose laughter still lived in memory with painful clarity. He did not bring that grief to the surface. He carried it where discipline could hold it steady. At the tomb, he did not ask the past to ease. He asked only for the strength to keep faith with it. When he turned and resumed his cadence, the crowd followed him with their eyes like congregants, tracking a liturgy they did not need explained. No one cheered. No one clapped. Respect required no soundtrack. The rhythm of his boots on wet marble said enough, and the place answered back with stone, flag, and ordered silence, as if the whole hillside agreed that honor did not need decoration to endure. And then orange crossed the white. A woman in a luxury trench coat exploded over the visitor chain, with one hand still gripping a phone rig clipped to her collar, and the other whipping a paint canister toward the sarcophagus, in a hard, flat arc, her voice cutting the ceremony like a blade. War myth should be defaced. The canister struck the upper edge of marble and burst bright across stone that had held silence for generations. The crowd froze where it stood. Veterans half rose and stopped. Children clutched sleeves. Phones hung in midair, forgotten. What Sloane Mercer saw as a ceremonial prop was a sacred line, and what she did not know, not yet, was that the sentinel she had chosen was trained to read impact angles and crowd panic long before chaos had a chance to spread. The sound came first, sharper than anyone expected, a metallic crack and a wet slap that echoed off the terrace and rolled down the hillside toward the ordered ranks of headstones. The orange paint looked violent against pale marble, a fresh wound in a place built on restraint. For a fraction of a second, even the wind seemed to hold itself back. Frank had just completed his pause at the line when the strike landed. To those nearest the rail, he appeared unchanged, face carved from stone, rifle steady, shoulders square, but inside him a different clock had already started. Distance to thrower, distance to rail, number of civilians in immediate path, exit routes if crowd surged left. Slip risk on rain-slick stone, now worsened by paint. Position of the child in the wheelchair on the right side aisle. Potential second device. He read it in one sweep, the way infantry training had burned into him years earlier under louder skies and deadlier stakes. His breathing stayed level. His posture did not shift. His eyes moved once, no more than a fraction, and fixed on Sloane's throwing arm. Gasps spread outward in rings. The elderly Marine with the silver cane jerked forward as if to cross the chain, then checked himself and gripped the handle so hard his knuckles blanched. Lena's mother drew the wheelchair closer with a tight, protective pull. blanket wheel catching for a moment against the wet stone before sliding free. One of the high school boys whispered, "No, no, no," under his breath, and lowered his phone like it had become something shameful in his hand. A staff sergeant assigned to ceremonial support shouted for everyone to stay back, voice controlled but urgent, and the command snapped several people out of their stunned stillness. Sloane did not retreat. That was the second shock. She took one triumphant step inside the boundary as paint dripped down the marble edge and lifted her chin toward her streaming camera, angling her body for visibility the way performers find light by instinct. Her coat, already marked by old stains from prior stunts, gleamed with rain and color under the white morning sky. The clip light near her collar blinked red. She wanted the frame. She wanted the clip. She wanted the instant where she could point at the tomb and claim she had exposed a nation's hypocrisy. "Say it louder," she called toward her own lens, then reached into her bag for another canister. A collective murmur rose and died in the same breath. The second canister mattered more than the first. The first had struck stone. The second could strike anyone in the spill zone between rail and aisle. Frank tracked the movement of her wrist and saw her pivot, not just toward the sarcophagus now, but across the line where Lena sat, wrapped in her blanket, with the folded patch held against her chest. The trajectory was wrong for a symbolic throw and dangerous for the crowd. In Frank's mind, the calculus changed from vandalism to immediate civilian risk. He had learned that pivot years ago in Afghanistan, when a man in a crowded market shifted his shoulder 1 degree and turned a loud argument into a threat vector. He had learned it again outside Raqqa, when a motorcycle's angle on broken pavement told him an ambush had begun, half a breath before the first round cracked overhead. Training did not make him dramatic. It made him precise. He saw, assessed, and acted within the margin where harm could still be prevented. Behind him, the wreath detail faltered, but held formation. Ceremony officials looked to the on-site lieutenant colonel, who had already started moving from the left flank with 2 military police officers, boots striking hard through shallow puddles. Their route narrowed as civilians bunched instinctively at the rail. The old Marine shouted, "Stand fast!" Not to the soldiers, but to the crowd, and people obeyed him without argument. Lena's eyes stayed on Frank, wide and fixed, while her mother whispered, "Look at me, baby, look at me," though the child did not look away from the sentinel. Sloane shook the second canister with quick, practiced snaps. The rattle inside it sounded small, almost childish, against the gravity of the plaza. She raised it shoulder high, elbow out, and drew breath for another slogan. Frank broke line by 1 step. It was a tiny movement, and it split the morning in 2. Every person who understood that post felt the weight of that step like a physical force. Protocol at the tomb was not casual choreography. It was sacred law in motion, and any deviation meant necessity, not preference. His left boot cut across the wet marble. His torso pivoted with mechanical precision. His white-gloved hand came up on the canister's path exactly as Sloane released. The cylinder struck his palm, thudded once against leather, and he closed his grip before the valve could burst open. Paint hissed at the seam, then died. A few orange drops flecked his glove and dark sleeve. Nothing reached Lena. Nothing reached the people behind her. He did not shout. He did not lunge. He stood in front of the throw line with the intercepted canister locked in his hand and spoke 1 sentence in a calm cadence that carried farther than any yell could have. "You will not stain the dead to advertise yourself." Sloane froze, mouth open, eyes fixed not on the camera now, but on Frank's face, as if she had expected resistance from security barriers and lectures from officials, but not this kind of still authority from the man she had dismissed as a prop. The crowd exhaled in a single rough wave. Somebody sobbed once and covered their mouth. The high school student who had whispered earlier stared at Frank and said almost reverently, "He caught it." The lieutenant colonel arrived within seconds, voice clipped and formal. "Military police detainer. Secure that device. Preserve scene integrity." Two MPs moved past Frank, each motion controlled, and took Sloane by the wrists without spectacle. She offered one reflexive pull backward toward her camera, then stopped when she saw there was no audience left in the plaza willing to cheer her. Her live stream still ran, red light blinking, capturing her silence as the canister was bagged and her hands were guided behind her back. The moment held there, stretched thin as wire, with rain still threading down the marble and orange paint still sliding in narrow rivulets along carved stone. In that suspended space, the truth of Frank Nguyen came into focus for everyone who had just watched him move. He was not a performer in a perfect uniform waiting for tourists to pass. He was a combat veteran with 2 Afghanistan tours, a Syria deployment, and instincts that had survived louder terrain than any crowd would ever hear. The old shrapnel scar in his left shoulder burned in damp weather and never changed his cadence. The vow that brought him to this post had never been abstract, and now the plaza had seen what that vow looked like under pressure. As MPs guided Sloane toward the perimeter, she turned once toward the phone rig and tried to lift her chin back into broadcast posture. One officer blocked the lens with his body. The other secured her hands and moved her forward at a steady pace. The red light blinked a final time before the device was powered down. The lieutenant colonel stepped to Frank, accepted the intercepted canister with gloved care, and gave a single nod that carried institutional weight without theatrics. "Lawful intervention," he said, voice low but audible to those nearest the rail. "Protection of memorial and civilians confirmed." Procedure tightened around the scene immediately. One MP marked the first canister's impact point at the sarcophagus edge. Another photographed the paint spread and sealed both containers in evidence bags with timestamps called out for witness logging. Federal Protective Service personnel received the livestream rig and battery pack for chain of custody transfer. A ceremonial staff sergeant redirected foot traffic away from the stained section of stone and ordered absorbent mats placed on the slickest runnels before anyone slipped. The efficiency itself calmed people. Discipline was contagious when panic had nowhere left to root. Near the front rail, Maria Ortiz dropped to one knee beside Lena and checked her daughter's hands, then face, then shoulders, confirming what mattered with touch. Lena did not cry. She kept staring at Frank, then lifted her father's unit patch with both hands and pressed it once to her chest. Maria followed her gaze and for a moment said nothing at all. The elderly Marine with the silver cane straightened as far as his spine allowed and brought his right hand up in a formal salute, fingers steady despite the tremor in his forearm. Beside him, the Gold Star mother in black gloves stood motionless, chin level, eyes on the tomb, her composure so complete it read as its own kind of grief. A few rows back, the docent who had been quietly explaining cadence and protocol resumed in an even whisper for the students nearest him, clarifying why a sentinel almost never breaks line and what it means when one does. No one interrupted him. Several teenagers lowered their phones all the way to their sides. Rain gathered at the brim of Frank's cap and traced a line down his jaw. Orange flecks dried on one glove and the edge of his sleeve, small marks against the white and blue that looked almost unreal in the muted morning light. He did not inspect them. He handed over the canister, recentered on his axis, and waited for command. The lieutenant colonel checked the perimeter once more, confirmed Sloane was clear of the ceremonial boundary, then gave a brief signal to continue. The wreath team adjusted spacing by inches and reset posture without speaking. Officials verified the immediate walkway was safe, leaving the impact area isolated for preservation and cleanup timing. The crowd, now packed tighter under umbrellas and hoods, settled back into silence that felt different from the silence before. It carried shock, yes, but also recognition of how thin the line had been and how quickly it had held. Frank returned to his measured path. 1 step, 2. The wet marble answered under his soles with soft, precise taps. At 21, he turned, paused, and faced the tomb, with the same exact bearing he had held before the disruption, as if continuity itself were part of the defense. The mist moved low across the terrace. The paint remained visible, a bright violation awaiting careful removal. The watch did not break. Lena watched the turn and finally looked to her mother. Maria brushed rain from her daughter's hair and squeezed her shoulder. Behind them, the old Marine lowered his salute with deliberate control. Farther back, visitors who had arrived for a ceremony now stood inside a lesson they had not expected. Reverence was not fragile, and discipline was not theater. By the time the next cadence began, the plaza had found its breath again. The tomb stood marked but guarded, the crowd quiet but steadier, the formal wreath sequence still pending, and Frank Nguyen already moving through the count, as if the morning had only sharpened what he was there to do. The cadence rolled forward, and the plaza followed it like a pulse returning to a body. Rain hung in the air as a fine, cold mist, too light for umbrellas to matter and steady enough to bead along every hard surface. Water gathered at the corners of the sarcophagus and slid past the orange stain in slow threads, as if the stone itself refused to hurry. The wreath detail stood reset in perfect geometry, uniforms darkened at the shoulders by weather, white gloves bright against gray morning. Off the terrace, the long descending fields of headstones looked almost luminous through the haze, row after row of white markers aligned with mathematical certainty, each one a name, a date, a life reduced to clean lines and enduring silence. At 8:17, a bell tone from a distant maintenance cart drifted up and vanished under the measured strike of Frank's boots. Heel, sole, halt. Heel, sole, halt. The sound traveled across wet marble and returned softer, as if the plaza answered him out of respect. He moved with the same controlled force he had held before the breach. No extra speed, no flourish, no sign that adrenaline still moved like current under his skin. His kepi remained level, brim cutting a precise horizontal line through the mist. His jacket sat flawless across his chest and shoulders despite the rain, every seam straight, every crease still sharp enough to cut glass. The brass on his uniform caught what little light the morning offered and gave it back in disciplined glints. One glove had been swapped. The fresh white leather looked untouched, ritual purity restored in under a minute. The crowd had changed shape without losing its center. The elderly Marine with the silver cane, name patch reading Donnelly on his old field jacket, stood with his chin high and jaw tight, as if refusing his age in front of the unknowns. Beside him, a retired Army nurse named Elise Carter clasped both hands over her coat buttons, lips moving through a prayer too quiet to hear. 3 high school seniors from Fairfax, still shoulder to shoulder, no longer held their phones up. One had tucked his device deep into his backpack and stood at parade rest because he had seen somebody else do it, and understood imitation could be a form of respect. Maria Ortiz kept one hand on Lena's wheelchair handle and one on her daughter's shoulder, a protective hold that had eased from panic into grounding. Lena kept that battalion patch against her blanket and tracked Frank's turn with unwavering concentration, as if she were learning a language her father once spoke. The Gold Star mother in black gloves, Mrs. Halverson, stepped half a pace closer to the rail after the MPs cleared the route, not crossing any boundary, just narrowing the distance by inches that meant everything. A father in a work jacket lifted his son again, but this time the boy did not whisper questions. He stood very still in his father's arms and watched the sentinel's feet mark distance in exact counts. Two young analysts from a nearby federal office, ties damp and collars open, bowed their heads when the cadence passed. A bus driver on his break removed his cap and held it flat to his chest until the pass was complete. Arlington did that to people. It stripped performance from them. They arrived as spectators and, if they paid attention, left as witnesses. Frank reached his 21st step and halted into stillness, so complete it felt structural, as if a column had been set in place. The pause was brief and immense at once. Rifle shift, turn, resume. Under the white gloves and polished ceremony, his body remained a precision instrument. Breathing controlled to the count, shoulders square but not rigid, knees soft enough to absorb slick stone without ever showing adjustment. To the crowd, he looked carved from discipline. Inside, his situational map remained active in layers. Perimeter status, route clearance, remaining spill zones near the impact mark, position of Lena's chair, position of Donnelly's cane, position of ceremonial staff entering from the left stair. Years of infantry doctrine and repetition at the tomb merged into one operating truth. Vigilance was devotion in practical form. What no one near the chain could have guessed was how long that truth had taken to forge. Frank had not been built in ceremony. He had been built in dust and blast pressure and hard briefings under red lights. At 21, he had deployed to Kunar Province, Afghanistan, as part of a light infantry platoon that learned terrain by pain before they learned it by map. The first winter he spent there was all stone ridgelines, thin air, and villages where every doorway demanded judgment without certainty. He learned to read hands, shoulders, exits, and silence. He learned to sleep in fragments. He learned that fear, managed correctly, sharpened decision-making rather than weakening it. During his second Afghanistan tour, in Helmand, the heat became its own adversary. Rifles burned through gloves, optics shimmered, and patience ran thinner than water rations. He stayed steady anyway, because steadiness kept men alive when comfort disappeared. By the time he rotated into Syria, attached to an advisory element outside Raqqa, Frank had already seen enough to understand that courage rarely looked cinematic in real time. It looked like carrying extra radio batteries because somebody always forgot. It looked like checking a door frame twice because the first sweep missed a wire. It looked like staying awake when your body pleaded for sleep because another team had not yet checked in. In that rotation, he earned the Bronze Star with valor after a mortar barrage hit a makeshift casualty collection point, and he moved through open impact lanes to pull two wounded soldiers behind concrete shielding before secondary rounds landed. Reports later called it gallantry under fire. Frank never used the word. He called it Tuesday on a bad week. The scar across his left shoulder came 3 months earlier, on a narrow access road cut between low structures and broken walls where a shaped charge detonated against the lead vehicle. Metal fragments tore through the cabin, and one piece entered high near his clavicle before lodging near the scapula. Field medics stabilized him fast. Surgeons removed what they could, not all of it. In rain and cold, the tissue tightened like a clenched fist beneath the skin. At the tomb, under pressed wool and ceremony precision, that old wound still spoke in pressure and heat. He never gave it authority over his cadence. Pain had no vote in the oath he was keeping. The name that never left him, though, was Caleb Mercer. Sergeant Caleb Cal Mercer, squad leader, Georgia-born, loud laugh, terrible singer, the one man in the platoon who could make exhausted soldiers grin at 2 in the morning on cold rations. Cal had a habit of narrating miserable conditions like a game show host. In a sandstorm, he once shouted over comms, "Welcome back to scenic paradise, gentlemen, where visibility is fictional and dinner tastes like the moon." The whole stack laughed in spite of themselves and moved cleaner because morale had lifted half an inch. On another night, after 72 straight hours of operations and a failed generator, Cal dropped into a folding chair, kicked one boot off, and told Frank, "If I ever stop talking, Nguyen, assume I finally found a way to sleep through artillery." It was ridiculous. It was human. It was the line Frank still heard when silence grew too heavy. Cal died outside Raqqa in an ambush that began with one false lull and ended in seconds that stretched into permanent memory. Frank had been 2 positions back when the first burst cut across the alley mouth. Cal moved to redirect his team and took the rounds meant for the corridor behind him. They got him out. They fought for him in the dust under failing light, gloves slick with rain and dirt, voices steady because panic would not help. He was gone before evacuation reached the perimeter. Frank remembered the exact weight of Cal's radio in his own hand after the medics called time. He remembered folding Cal's flag at the memorial board weeks later with fingers that did not shake until he was alone. When his operational tours ended, Frank had options that would have looked sensible on paper: instructor track, staff advancement, private sector security contracting with easy money and less soul. He chose the old guard instead, and to outsiders it looked like a lateral move into ceremony. For him, it was covenant. He requested tomb duty because the unknown soldiers stood for men like Cal, and for thousands more whose stories ended without a witness to speak their names aloud. At the tomb, he could stand post for all of them at once. 21 steps became prayer with boots on marble. The rifle's shoulder change became promise made visible. The silence became an active labor, not absence, and he offered himself to that labor every shift. During selection and training, instructors tested not just precision, but temperament. Could he maintain ceremonial exactness under heat, rain, noise, and deliberate distraction? Could he preserve composure when tourists disrespected boundaries, when children cried, when camera flashes popped, when weather stripped comfort away? Could he carry both public symbolism and private grief without letting either distort the other? Frank passed because he understood the underlying equation. Duty at the tomb was not about being admired. It was about being trustworthy. Trustworthy with tradition. Trustworthy with protocol. Trustworthy with the emotional weight strangers brought to that marble, from funerals, folded flags, and old regrets. 3 days after his badge presentation, he visited Cal's parents in Savannah on personal leave, arriving in dress blues with a posture that made Mr. Mercer stand taller. Before he even opened the door, he did not bring speeches. He brought a photograph of their son grinning beside a burned coffee pot and a dented ammo can they had turned into a chess table between missions. Mrs. Mercer cried, then laughed when she heard the sleep through artillery line, then cried again. Before Frank left, Cal's father put a hand on his shoulder and said, "If you stand and watch up there, then my boy's not alone." Frank carried that sentence back to Arlington like a second set of orders. Now, in the rain-washed present, with orange paint still marked for forensic cleaning and federal evidence sealed for transfer, he completed another pass and paused at the line. The lieutenant colonel remained near the flank, speaking quietly into a radio, confirming chain of custody, pickup, and perimeter status without disrupting ceremony. Donnelly eased his grip on the cane. Maria leaned close to Lena and whispered, "That's what duty looks like." Lena did not answer right away. She raised her right hand in a small, trembling salute, patch pressed to her chest with the left, and held it through Frank's turn. Frank did not break bearing, but he saw it. He saw the child's hand, the veteran's posture, the mother's resolve, the crowd standing quieter now than when the morning began. He resumed his cadence, boots striking marble with renewed clarity, and the hillside of white stones watched over all of them in patient rows as the sacred rhythm carried on. As the sacred rhythm carried on, military police worked the outer control point beyond the visitor chain, while Sloan Mercer remained in custody and off the immediate plaza. The orange streaks on recovered fabric and gear flashed against the rain-gray stone like warning flares that refused to go out quietly, but the center of the scene had already shifted back to containment, procedure, and the tomb. Up close, stripped of live-stream angles and edited captions, the seized materials looked less like spontaneous protest props and more like a field producer's shot list. A second phone battery had been taped under a collar seam. 2 adhesive mic patches had been fixed inside a lapel to catch crowd reaction from both channels. Her bag held 3 capped paint canisters, 1 empty restraint strap, and a folded card printed with talking points in thick black type. Public property, public accountability, disrupt to expose. None of it was improvised. The breach had been storyboarded. Rain thinned to a cold mist that settled over shoulders and cap brims, and the crowd could now see MPs pause at the control point for evidence intake. Murmurs rippled, then tightened into hard silence when one officer lifted the bagged canisters for chain-of-custody photographs. A retired Air Force couple near the rear exchanged one glance and said nothing. A college student in a denim jacket whispered, "She brought extras." And the words spread in fragments from row to row like a low current of disbelief. Sloane's confidence had been built over years in places where consequences were mostly social and temporary. She had turned disruption into a career model, targeting museum wings, city statuary, and ceremonial halls, always choosing locations with strict decorum because decorum gave her an advantage. Staff would hesitate. Security would negotiate. Onlookers would film. She would control the narrative before the institution finished drafting a statement. She called it moral confrontation. Sponsors called it engagement. Her followers called it fearless truth. What she called courage was often timing. Weeks earlier, she had posted a planning video from a studio lit in white and amber, explaining to subscribers that state ritual survives on obedience theater. And she had tapped a map of Arlington with manicured certainty, while promising a live interruption at the center of military mythology. Her producer had asked whether uniformed guards might intervene physically. She laughed and shook her head. Not there. They can't. They're parade pieces. They freeze, then supervisors talk. She had built her whole plan on that assumption, and she had repeated it until it sounded like fact. The fatal misread was not ideological. It was operational. She had mistaken discipline for passivity. At the tomb, discipline was a combat-grade instrument dressed in ceremonial precision. Frank Nguyen's stillness was not decorative stillness. It was controlled readiness, shaped by doctrine, repetition, and losses she would never carry. She had looked at polished boots and white gloves and decided she was facing a prop. She had not seen the infantryman under the kepi, the man who had learned to read hand speed and shoulder angle against chaos, the sentinel trained to preserve order without spectacle. In the gap between what she believed and what was true, her strategy collapsed. Near the left stair, Lieutenant Colonel Harris reviewed the seizure log with clipped efficiency while a federal protective agent photographed the collar rig from 3 angles. Item 4, secondary battery pack, red tape marker, the agent said. Item 5, cue card. Harris nodded once. Document all media devices. Preserve timestamps from stream start to detention. His tone carried no anger, only command. The language of institutions that understood the difference between outrage and procedure. A transcript team working from captured live stream audio logged one final line, shouted during removal. "You're proving my point. He broke protocol for Stone." But on the plaza itself, the words had no traction. No applause, no call and response. Just the soft hiss of mist on fabric, and the distant cadence of boots returning across marble. From the front rail, Donnelly answered without raising his volume. He broke protocol for people. The words struck harder than any shout. Several visitors lowered their eyes. Maria Ortiz pressed her lips together and squeezed Lena's shoulder once, a silent confirmation that what had happened was now being named correctly in public, where names mattered. Lena kept her gaze fixed on Frank's route, tracking each turn with grave attention. Father's patch still anchored under her left hand like a compact oath. A military legal observer attached to the ceremony, Colonel Amelia Price from the Judge Advocate community, had watched the breach from 10 yards off axis, and she now stood with a notebook tucked inside her coat, expression sharp with professional clarity. She had seen protest cases, civil disobedience claims, and media provocation defenses across a decade of hearings. She also knew the threshold where symbolic trespass became imminent risk to a protected site and nearby civilians. Quietly to Harris, she said. Her second throw lane crossed occupied seating. Sentinel response was proportionate and narrowly targeted. That holds. Harris answered, "Understood, Colonel," and added her statement to the incident packet. Frank reached his 21st step and paused, turned, resumed. From the crowd, he remained what he had always appeared to be, motionless between motions, face unreadable, shoulders level, rifle steady. Inside him, the event had not ended. It had been indexed. Every second of it replayed in precise sequence, not as rumination, but as professional after-action. The reflex of a soldier who survived by reviewing terrain even while moving through it. First canister impact angle. Crowd compression at right rail. Child in wheelchair at risk line. Secondary canister, release point. Hand interception at valve seam. Command voice output. Transfer to MPs. Scene restored. The replay sharpened his awareness rather than distracting it. He tracked Donnelly's cane tip on wet stone and noted the slight slip risk near the painted runoff. He tracked Lena's chair position, now 2 feet farther from the aisle. He tracked a young father with a restless toddler, shifting weight too close to the chain. He tracked a camera crew at the upper path waiting for permission before lifting lenses. Every muscle held readiness under ceremony posture, coiled without visible tension. His pulse had settled, but his instincts had not stood down. As the cadence continued, an MP sergeant signaled all clear for ceremonial continuation, while cleanup specialists staged neutralizing materials behind visual cover to avoid disrupting memorial sightlines. The orange streak on marble remained for evidence imaging, vivid and unresolved, and that unresolved mark exerted pressure on everyone watching. It represented violation. It also represented containment. The dead had not been abandoned to spectacle. The line had held. At the command post edge, Price reviewed preliminary charging language with Harris. Restricted boundary breach, destruction or defacement of federal property, and endangerment, tied to throw trajectory across occupied space. The record will reflect conduct, not slogans, she said, voice low enough not to carry past the rail. Harris gave a single nod and continued radio coordination with MPs handling transport and chain of custody transfer off-site. What no one heard from Frank was triumph. There was none in him. Pride, yes, but the quiet pride of responsibility met under pressure, not of opponent defeated. In his chest, beneath uniform wool and rain chill, grief and duty moved in the same channel they always had. Cal's voice existed there, warm and irreverent in memory, paired now with the image of Lena's raised salute and Donnelly's steady hand. The living and the dead shared this ground, and he carried both without letting either break cadence. The confrontation did not explode again. It condensed. A teenage boy near the rear, cheeks pale from adrenaline, asked his grandfather in a whisper, "Was he allowed to do that?" The older man, a former artillery captain, answered, "He was required to." The boy nodded slowly, processing that sentence as if a door had opened in his understanding of strength. Not loud strength, not theatrical strength, disciplined strength, bounded by oath. Harris stepped to the rail and addressed the witnesses closest to the breach zone. "The ceremony will continue. Please remain behind the chain. Thank you for your composure." He did not embellish, and he did not need to. His authority lay in restraint, the same principle Frank embodied on the mat. Off the immediate plaza, MPS completed transfer processing at the service drive, and radio confirmation of secure movement passed back to Harris without fanfare. The crowd did not turn toward the update. By then, their attention had become a wall of quiet focus fixed on the tomb and the sentinel guarding it. Her campaign had depended on viral outrage. What held instead was civic sobriety, the harder force. In the plaza, tension lingered as a physical residue. Shoulders remained high. Hands stayed clasped. Breaths came shorter than normal, yet the rhythm of boots began to regulate the space again, pass by pass, count by count, until the crowd's breathing unconsciously matched it. Frank advanced, halted, turned, advanced. The sacred choreography reasserted its structure over nerves, over anger, over rain. Lena lifted her right hand again, steadier this time, and held the salute through one full pass. Frank did not look at her directly, but he marked it in his peripheral map and adjusted nothing, because the highest respect he could offer that child was fidelity to the duty she was saluting. Maria's protective posture, rigid minutes earlier, eased into reassurance as she leaned close and whispered something only Lena could hear, then settled back with one hand resting gently on the wheelchair handle. Mrs. Halverson remained at the rail, gloved hands folded, head bowed for a brief breath before lifting her gaze to Frank's next turn. After MP clearance, she had quietly re-engaged, reverent and composed, returning her full attention to the ceremony as if reclaiming sacred ground by witness alone. A few feet behind her, Elise Carter stood with clinical stillness, nurse-trained eyes scanning faces for delayed shock, while never intruding on anyone's private grief. Colonel Price closed her notebook and watched Frank complete another turn. She had spent her career at the intersection of law and force, where institutions were tested by stress. What she saw now was the cleanest version of that test, an individual under strict protocol recognizing a non-trivial threat, applying minimal intervention, then returning authority to process without ego. Few tribunals ever saw conduct that precise under public pressure. She would note it later in exact language. The crowd froze one last time when a gust of wind lifted mist across the sarcophagus and briefly sharpened the orange mark into bright relief against white stone. Then the gust passed. The color dulled under moisture. Boots struck marble again with patient certainty. Around the plaza, people who had arrived as strangers stood inside a shared understanding that had taken only seconds to earn and would take years to forget. Honor was not a costume, and memory was not defenseless. Frank reached the line, paused into stillness, and turned back toward the tomb while the morning held its breath around him. In that suspended quiet, every witness carried the same image at once. A white-gloved hand cutting across orange trajectory. A single step-breaking sacred pattern only because sacred duty demanded it, and a sentence delivered with the calm force of doctrine. The plaza did not need a screen to replay it. It was already replaying behind hundreds of eyes. Lieutenant Colonel Harris lifted 2 fingers toward the outer control point, and an MP sergeant moved quickly through mist with a secured tablet in a clear evidence sleeve. Colonel Amelia Price stepped beside Harris, rain beating on her collar, notebook tucked under one arm. Neither spoke until the chain line was stable and the next pass complete. Then Harris gave a clipped instruction. Time stamped the second release and interception. Audio on. The sergeant nodded, keyed the file, and angled the screen so Price, Harris, and 2 designated witnesses could see without breaking perimeter discipline. The livestream footage shuddered with handheld motion and performative framing, then stabilized on the throw lane. Even stripped of commentary, the sequence looked violent against marble and mist. Sloane's arm snapped forward. The canister left her hand in a flat, reckless line. On screen, Frank moved 1 step. 1. Not 2. Not a charge, not a tackle. Not a theatrical rush. 1 measured displacement of boots on rain-dark stone, torso pivoting with exact geometry, glove meeting metal at the valve seam. The frame caught the paint hiss as a brief orange breath against white leather. Then nothing. No burst, no spray into the right aisle, no strike into Lena's row. The recorded audio lifted his line from the speakers in a steady baritone that sounded even colder through compression. You will not stain the dead to advertise yourself. Price exhaled through her nose and said, Clean intervention. Minimal force. Civilian lane preserved. Harris answered without looking away from the footage. Mark that as primary legal finding. The MP sergeant tagged the moment and read back the log entry. Beside them, Donnelly stood at rigid attention with his cane planted like a staff, and watched the replay once, jaw set, then turned his eyes back to the tomb, as if the record was complete. Near the rail, the teenage boy who had asked his grandfather about permission tightened his lips and whispered. He caught it before it opened. His grandfather gave a small nod. That's training. And restraint. Maria Ortiz heard them, looked down at Lena, and brushed rain from her daughter's brow. Lena kept her salute hand close to her chest now, fingers curled around the patch, eyes still locked on Frank's cadence with solemn concentration that looked older than 9. A radio at Harris's shoulder crackled with outer perimeter traffic. Detainee Mercer arrived intake point. Transfer team holding for transport release. No return to plaza. The MP sergeant opened a second file and played body cam capture from the initial removal lane. Sloane's voice, breathless and sharp over rain and bootsteps. It was protest, not violence. Price listened, then answered for the record rather than the speaker. Her first throw defaced federal memorial property. Her second throw crossed occupied civilian space. The distinction is now evidence, not opinion. The sergeant entered the statement as an evidentiary annotation and confirmed time sync with the livestream archive. Frank continued. Heel, soul, halt. Heel, soul, halt. The cemetery's geometry remained unchanged by the outburst that had tried to hijack it. White headstones stood in disciplined ranks down the slopes, and the flag above the amphitheater lifted and settled with patient authority. On each pass, Frank's face stayed unreadable, but inside him the after-action sequence tightened into final clarity. Threat recognized, lane protected, civilian risk reduced. Control returned to command, no excess, no deviation beyond necessity. He had done what the post required and no more. Another transmission clicked across CommandNet, routed from protective service to district operations, then back down to Plaza Control. Harris acknowledged, gave a short sit-rep without lifting his voice, and kept his eyes on the route. Moments later, a black staff vehicle rolled to the restricted approach and stopped cleanly behind the control line. Brigadier General Marcus Whitaker stepped out into mist in service dress, rain darkening his shoulders within seconds. He did not stride for spectacle. He moved with the fast economy of someone who understood both optics and obligation. Two aides remained back. Whitaker came forward alone to Harris and Price, received their rapid report, then requested the tablet, and watched the decisive sequence once in full. He handed the device back and asked one question. "Any civilian injuries?" Harris replied, "Negative, sir." Whitaker's gaze shifted to Lena's row, then to the stained marble, then to Frank crossing his line in exact count. Then the sentinel did his duty. Harris gave the operational summary in clipped phrases. Boundary breach, first impact on sarcophagus edge, second release intercepted, suspect detained, canisters bagged, stream archived, chain of custody intact, detainee already at intake pending movement through the service drive. Price added legal posture. Probable charges supportable under federal vandalism and ceremonial interference statutes, with aggravating risk factor tied to occupied seating lane. Whitaker listened without interruption, then nodded once. "Proceed. Full referral." The general stepped to where his voice could carry to witnesses without becoming a speech. Rain ticked softly against caps and coat sleeves as the crowd turned toward him. "For the record," he said, "the Sentinel's intervention was lawful, proportionate, and necessary to protect this memorial and the civilians present. Discipline at this post is not passivity. It is protection." His eyes moved across the rail, settling briefly on veterans, families, and students alike. "The ceremony continues. Respect the boundary." The words landed like a seal on the morning. Murmurs that had lingered at the edges flattened into unanimous quiet. The high school students, who had looked embarrassed earlier, now stood straighter, phones away. Elise Carter, the retired nurse, closed her eyes for one brief breath and reopened them with visible steadiness. Mrs. Halverson, in black gloves, bowed her head, then raised it again toward the tomb with a composure that felt like reclaimed ground. Whitaker turned back to Harris. "Confirmed detainee movement. No media corridor at this perimeter." Harris keyed his handset. A beat later, the reply came from the service route. "Transport rolling now. Intake complete." Harris answered, "Copy." On a parallel channel, an MP at the control point read from the escort report that had just been uploaded. Sloan attempted to lift her chin into performance mode and said, "People are watching." Harris, on scene at the time of removal, had answered in a tone stripped to command, "They already watched." The transcript locked under incident addendum, then closed. As the transport cleared the gate, the federal agent at intake read the property inventory aloud for chain confirmation over recorded line. 3 unopened paint canisters, 1 expended shell, collar-mounted camera rig, secondary battery, cue card, mobile device, adhesive mics. The receiving officer repeated each item, signed and sealed. Price added her witness notation and closed the legal packet for transport. Every object that had entered the plaza as theater left it as documented evidence. Whitaker remained only long enough to ensure order was restored through command, then stepped to the edge of Frank's route and waited for a pause point. At the next halt, he spoke in a low register, meant for the sentinel alone. "Sergeant Nguyen." Frank did not break bearing. "Sir." Whitaker's next words were brief and formal. "Your judgment honored the unknowns and protected the living. Continue your watch." Frank answered exactly as trained. "Yes, sir." No handshake, no flourish. The general moved off the mat, saluted the tomb, and withdrew to let ritual reclaim the center. The crowd felt the shift immediately. Institutional authority had spoken. Consequence had been assigned. The breach, once raw and bright, had been absorbed into law, command, and memory. What remained was duty in motion. Frank stepped out again on count, his boots clicking in perfect rhythm across rain-dark marble, each pass rethreading the morning back into sacred order. Lena lifted her hand one more time, this time without trembling, 2 fingers touching the edge of the patch before she formed a careful salute. Maria watched her daughter's face and, for the first time since the throw, allowed herself a small, steadying smile. Donnelly eased his shoulders and tapped his cane once against stone in quiet acknowledgement, then stood straight as the sentinel passed. Cleanup teams waited beyond sight line for final authorization, evidence already captured, stain removal prepared with museum-grade care so the marble would be restored without erasing the official record. Harris confirmed the timing. Price confirmed release. The plaza would be cleaned, the file would move, and the law would carry what emotion no longer needed to hold in open air. A final radio update passed quietly from the service drive. "Detainee vehicle. Clear of memorial perimeter." Harris acknowledged with a single click and lowered his hand. Frank reached 21, paused, turned, and returned down the mat with the same immaculate precision he had carried before the breach. The mist thinned further. The white rose beyond the terrace sharpened in the growing light. Around him, veterans, children, parents, and strangers stood in a silence that was no longer shock, but reverence tested and proven. Reverence tested and proven settled into the crowd like a weight they were willing to carry. Harris stepped back from the rail and lifted his handset once more. "Control. This is Plaza Command. Authorize staged restoration on my mark. Confirm all evidence packets are sealed and departed." The reply came through static and rain hiss. "Confirmed, sir. Evidence packets 1 through 9 logged at intake, photographed, and transferred to federal custody. Digital archive mirrored to legal server and incident command drive." Harris glanced toward Colonel Price. She gave one short nod, then spoke into her own recorder, precise as a blade. "Chain of custody intact. No unlogged items remain on scene." That sentence closed the first wound in the morning. A cleanup team in plain rain gear approached from the service side, carrying neutral pH solution, lint-free cloths, and absorbent pads in hard cases. They moved with the careful choreography of medics entering a chapel. No rushing, no show. One technician paused at the edge of the stain and waited for Price's final visual confirmation that forensic imaging was complete. She crouched, checked the timestamp overlay on the last photograph, and rose. "Proceed with restoration. Preserve sample swab 3 for lab reference." The technician answered, "Yes, ma'am," and began the first slow pass over the orange streak with a hand steady enough for surgery. By 9:02, the rain had thinned to a fine mist that hung over the terrace like breath, and the bright paint that had shouted across marble was fading into damp cloth, one measured stroke at a time. Frank kept walking. 21 steps, a pause, a turn, then the cadence again. He did not look toward the cleanup team. He did not look toward the command post. His face remained a carved mask of discipline, eyes fixed down his route, rifle held with ceremonial precision. Inside him, the pressure had shifted from immediate threat to final guardianship. The site had been protected. Civilians had been protected. Procedure had held. Now the duty was continuity, because at the tomb, continuity was more than routine. It was proof that the dead were not at the mercy of the living's worst impulses. At the rail, Donnelly lowered himself carefully onto the bench behind him, for the first time all morning. His silver cane rested across his knees. He watched one full pass, then leaned toward the teenage boy at his side, the one who had asked questions in whispers. "You saw that step?" he said quietly. The boy nodded. Donnelly tapped the cane once against his boot. "That's not anger. That's control. Anybody can swing. Not everybody can stop exactly where they mean to." The boy swallowed and said, "I thought guards here were mostly ceremony." Donnelly's eyes stayed on Frank. "Ceremony is what discipline looks like when it's done right." A few feet away, Mrs. Halverson finally turned to Elise Carter, the retired nurse who had stood near her in silence. The Gold Star mother's expression was composed, but her voice carried old weather in it. "I almost left when the paint hit," she admitted. "I thought I couldn't watch another thing get taken from us." Elise touched her sleeve lightly. "You stayed." Mrs. Halverson looked back at the tomb. So did he. Near the front, Maria Ortiz knelt beside Lena and adjusted the blanket around her daughter's legs. The battalion patch remained in Lena's hand, edges damp from her fingers. "Mom," Lena whispered. "Did I do the salute right?" Maria brushed a strand of hair from her forehead. "You did it with respect. That's what matters most." Lena watched Frank pause and turn. "He saw me." Maria followed her gaze and answered with quiet certainty. "Yes, he did." At command, Price received one final call on a secure line, listened, and answered in clipped legal cadence. "Understood. Initial charging package accepted for filing. Add civilian risk notation and ceremonial interference enhancement. I'll transmit witness list within the hour." She ended the call and looked to Harris. "The referral landed. No delay." Harris exhaled once, not relief exactly, but completion. "Then every report we opened this morning has an endpoint." He checked his log and read it back for confirmation, while the mist drifted through the colonnade. "Outer perimeter call answered. Detainee transfer confirmed. Evidence manifest confirmed. Livestream archive and body cam sync confirmed. Legal intake accepted." Price signed the bottom of the sheet with rain-dark ink and closed the folder. "Nothing pending on site." The cleanup technician replaced a saturated cloth with a fresh one. Under patient work, the last bright residue softened, then lifted. Orange became pale rust, then ghost, then memory. A second specialist blotted moisture from the carved edge and checked for pigment trapped in microfractures. None remained visible. He stood, stepped back, and said to Harris, "Surface restored, sir. No etching." Harris inclined his head. "Thank you. Stand down to rear." That sentence closed the second wound. Frank reached his line, halted, and turned, boots striking wet marble with the same exact authority as at dawn. The sound traveled across the plaza and settled into the bones of everyone listening. The crowd was larger now, but quieter than before. New visitors had arrived mid-incident and now stood shoulder to shoulder with those who had seen everything. No one needed a recap. The atmosphere itself told the story. Restored stone, sealed evidence, command composure, sentinel unwavering. Brigadier General Whitaker remained at the edge of the ceremonial perimeter long enough to witness the full restoration. When Harris gave him the all-clear, he stepped toward Donnelly, recognized the old Marine's stance, and offered a formal salute. Donnelly returned it from the bench, spine straight, despite pain. Whitaker then looked down to Lena. "Young lady," he said, voice low and respectful. That was a strong salute. Lena tightened her grip on the patch and answered, "My dad taught me with pictures." Whitaker's expression softened by a degree. "Then he taught you well?" He moved off without another word, leaving the moment to the family. As the ceremony concluded, the crowd began to thin in respectful silence, but several people remained. Donnelly, Mrs. Halverson, Elise, the three students, Maria and Lena. They did not linger from curiosity now. They lingered because something in them needed to stand a little longer on that stone. At 9:18, Frank's relief arrived at the flank, and the exchange unfolded with ritual precision, every movement exact, every angle measured. When the handoff was complete, Frank stepped off the mat and moved to the service side, posture still formal, rain beating on his cap and shoulders. A staff sergeant offered him a dry glove and a towel for his sleeve. Frank accepted both with a quiet, "Thank you," then turned as Harris approached. "No further action required from you on statements," Harris said. "Your verbal account is already corroborated by 3 angles and 12 witnesses." Frank's reply was steady. "Understood, sir." Price joined them, folder tucked under her arm. "For what it's worth, Sergeant, your timing prevented a civilian strike by less than a second." Frank gave one restrained nod. "Then the training worked." Maria guided Lena's wheelchair along the approved path toward the edge of the service lane and stopped at a respectful distance. Lena looked up at Frank with the solemn courage only children and veterans seemed to share. "Sergeant Nguyen," she said, voice small but clear. Frank turned fully toward her, heels together. "Yes, ma'am." She held up the patch. "This was my dad's. He was in 2nd Battalion. I wanted you to see it." Frank's eyes dropped to the stitched insignia, then lifted to her face. For the first time all morning, emotion touched his expression. Not loss of control, only recognition. "That is a good unit," he said. "Your father served with honor." Lena took a breath. "Did I salute okay for him?" Frank answered without hesitation. "You saluted exactly right." Donnelly had come up behind them, cane planted, rein on his shoulders, eyes bright. He looked at Lena, then at Frank. "Son," he said, voice roughened by decades, "I stood up too late when she jumped that chain." "You didn't." Frank met the old Marine's gaze. "You held the crowd in place. That prevented a surge. We both did our part." Donnelly absorbed that, then gave a slow nod that looked like acceptance of a burden shared. Mrs. Halverson stopped a few steps away and spoke toward Frank, but not loudly. "My boy is buried on the south slope. I come here when I can't hear him anymore." She glanced toward the tomb. "Today, I could hear him again." Frank did not answer with comfort phrases or grand declarations. He placed his right hand over his heart and bowed his head once, a gesture brief and absolute. Mrs. Halverson returned the nod and stepped back, tears in her eyes she did not hide. One of the high school students, the one who had put his phone away first, approached Harris with awkward resolve. "Sir, we recorded some of it from the back before we understood what was happening. If investigators need the files, we'll send everything." Harris took down their names and school contact, then handed the list to Price. "Thank you. That closes our last witness gap." The student looked relieved, as if being useful had given him a way to carry what he had seen. No one else had unfinished words. The loaded looks from earlier had become sentences, acknowledgments, or silent bows. Nothing remained hanging in the air, unnamed. Frank returned to the mat for the next scheduled watch interval, uniform reset to immaculate lines, fresh gloves bright against the rifle. The sky had begun to open in thin bands of clearer gray. Across the hillside, the headstones stood in endless ordered rows, white against wet green. The flag above the terrace lifted, settled, and lifted again. He stepped out. His boots clicked in perfect rhythm across restored marble. 21 steps. Pause. Turn. Repeat. Lena raised one final salute beside her mother. Donnelly rose with his cane and came to attention. And the tomb of the unknown soldier stood guarded beneath the quiet morning as earned honor outlasted spectacle, exactly as it always had.